The rounds punched through the hull plating like it had been made of canvas. TA-27 sat low in the Adriatic, somewhere off the Dalmatian coast, in the kind of flat gray water that makes a ship visible from 15 miles up. She had once carried an Italian name, Ariga, and served under the Regia Marina until September of 1943, when Italy's surrender handed her over to the Kriegsmarine. Along with dozens of other small warships, the Germans suddenly needed to patrol a coastline they'd never planned to hold. Her crew, a mix of German sailors and reassigned personnel who barely knew the vessel's quirks, had standing orders to interdict partisan supply lines and keep the Adriatic from becoming an Allied highway. On this particular day in 1944, that mission put her exactly where she should not have been, under open sky, without air cover, moving at a speed that looked stationary from the cockpit of a diving fighter. The American aircraft that found her carried no bombs, no torpedoes, no rockets slung under the wings, nothing in the ordnance package that naval doctrine said you needed to kill a warship. What it carried, what the pilot had to work with, amounted to 2 Browning M2 50 caliber machine guns, belt-fed, firing armor-piercing incendiary rounds at a cyclic rate of roughly 800 rounds per minute per gun, against a destroyer-class vessel with steel hull plating, watertight compartments, and damage control parties trained in the German tradition. That should have been a nuisance, a strafing run that chipped paint and killed a few men on deck, the kind of attack a warship absorbs, patches, and sails home from. The crew of TA-27 had every reason to believe they would survive contact with an aircraft this lightly armed. Stories like this one, where the math says one thing and the ocean says another, are the reason this channel exists. A like and a subscribe keep these records from disappearing into the noise. If your grandfather flew in the Mediterranean theater or served on any vessel in the Adriatic, put his name in the comments. The fighter came in low. 50 caliber API rounds, armor-piercing incendiary, the designation matters here. Do not behave the way a layman expects when they meet thin naval steel at close range. They do not bounce, they do not flatten. The tungsten-carbide core punches through, and the incendiary compound ignites on the far side of the plate, inside the ship, spraying white-hot fragments into whatever compartment happens to be behind the point of entry. Against the armored belt of a fleet battleship, this does nothing. Against the relatively thin hull plating of a former Italian torpedo boat, reclassified as a destroyer-escort, the geometry changes entirely. TA-27 displaced roughly 1,000 tons. Her plating could stop shell splinters and small arms fire. It could not stop a concentrated burst of API 50 caliber at ranges under 300 yards, delivered by a pilot who held his line and walked the tracers into the waterline. The records do not preserve a second-by-second account from below decks. What they preserve is the outcome. Something critical ruptured, whether the rounds found a fuel bunker, an ammunition locker, or the ship's own depth charges stored topside. Sources conflict on the precise kill mechanism, and the Germans who survived had reasons to be vague about how a machine gun-armed fighter had just destroyed their vessel. The explosion tore TA-27 apart, not slowly, the way a torpedoed ship lists and settles over hours, while damage control teams fight the flooding. Fast. The kind of fast that turns a functioning warship into a debris field and a fuel slick in the time it takes a fighter to pull up, bank, and look back over its shoulder. Sailors in the water, smoke columning straight up in windless air. The shallow Adriatic swallowing 1,000 tons of steel that had been, 90 seconds earlier, a combat-capable vessel of the Kriegsmarine. 1 pilot, 2 50 caliber guns, no ordnance designed for anti-shipping work. A German destroyer dead on the surface of a sea the Reich could not afford to lose. The kill defied every assumption the Kriegsmarine held about air-to-surface lethality thresholds. German naval officers understood American air power as a bombing problem, something you countered with flak, with fighter cover, with evasive maneuvering against torpedo tracks. A strafing fighter did not register as an existential threat to a steel-hulled warship. That mental model had been built on reasonable evidence. Fleet destroyers had absorbed strafing runs across every theater of the war and continued fighting. The difference, and this is where the story earns its title, lay in the intersection of three variables. No German damage control manual had accounted for simultaneously the penetration characteristics of American API ammunition at point-blank range against thin-axis hull plating, the specific vulnerability profile of a repurposed Italian torpedo boat whose magazine and fuel storage layouts reflected 1938 Italian design philosophy rather than Kriegsmarine standards, and the willingness of one American pilot to hold a firing pass long enough and close enough to concentrate his rounds into a killing zone rather than spraying them across the superstructure for suppression. Any two of those variables, absent the third, produce a damaged ship that limps to port. All three together produced a catastrophe. The Kriegsmarine after-action paperwork, what survives of it, uses language that translates roughly to loss through enemy air attack, clinical. No mention of the absurd disproportion between the weapon and the result. To understand how a .50 caliber machine gun became a ship killer, the answer starts not in the Adriatic, but in a Massachusetts factory, where John Browning's last design rolled off the line with capabilities its own creators had not fully mapped. What kind of weapon gets designed for one war, ignored for 20 years, and then sinks a destroyer in a war nobody saw coming? John Browning started work on the .50 caliber concept in 1918 at the explicit request of General John J. Pershing, who wanted a heavy machine gun capable of defeating the armored plates the Germans had started bolting onto their observation positions and aircraft along the Western Front. Browning, already 63 years old, already responsible for more adopted U.S. military firearms than any single designer in history, took the basic operating principle of his M1917 water-cooled .30 caliber and scaled it up. Bigger receiver, heavier bolt, a cartridge built around a bullet that weighed 709 grains and left the muzzle at approximately 2,800 feet per second. The prototype fired for the first time in November of 1918. The war ended 11 days later. The gun had missed its moment, or so it seemed, and the peacetime army that inherited the design treated it the way peacetime armies treat most weapons that arrive too late to matter. They filed the paperwork, ran a few tests at Aberdeen Proving Ground, and shelved the project while the budget shrank to almost nothing. For the next 15 years, the M2 lived in a kind of institutional limbo. Springfield Armory produced small batches. The cavalry tested it on vehicles. The infantry mounted a few on tripods for anti-aircraft work and found the concept sound, but the funding absent. Nobody in the Ordnance Department championed the weapon with any urgency. The .50 caliber round itself, the 12.7 by 99 mm Browning machine gun cartridge, designated 50 BMG, sat in arsenals alongside ammunition types that dated to the previous century. The smell of those early storage facilities tells you something about how seriously the interwar army took logistics. Cosmoline, wood crates, damp concrete, rounds packed in cloth bandoliers inside wooden boxes stacked on pallets that nobody inventoried more than once a year. Two developments changed everything, and neither originated with the gun itself. The first came from metallurgy. In the late 1920s and early 1930s, American ammunition engineers at Frankford Arsenal in Philadelphia began experimenting with armor-piercing cores for the .50 caliber round. The original ball ammunition could penetrate mild steel at moderate ranges, but the new AP variants, and eventually the API, armor-piercing incendiary, used a hardened tungsten-carbide core seated inside a copper jacket with an incendiary compound packed into the nose cavity. The terminal ballistics shifted dramatically. At 300 yards, the API .50 caliber round could defeat nearly an inch of face-hardened armor plate. At point-blank strafing ranges, call it 100 to 200 yards, the penetration figures climbed higher. Against the 8 to 12 millimeter hull, plating typical of torpedo boats, escort vessels, and light combatants across every navy in the world, the round did not merely penetrate, it passed through, ignited, and kept moving. Frankfurt Arsenal's own test reports from the mid-1930s described the incendiary effect in language that reads more like an arson investigation than a ballistics study. White-eyed flash behind the plate, fragmentation cone expanding at 1,400 feet per second, secondary ignition of any flammable material within a 6-foot radius of the entry point. The second development came from the Army Air Corps, which decided, almost as an afterthought, to standardize the M2 as the primary fixed armament for pursuit aircraft. The decision had less to do with the gun's anti-ship potential, which nobody at Wright Field had seriously considered, than with its reliability at altitude and its compatibility with synchronization gear for firing through propeller arcs. The .50 caliber worked in cold air at 25,000 feet. It fed reliably from disintegrating metallic link belts. It could sustain bursts of 200 rounds without cooking off or jamming, provided the headspace and timing had been set correctly, a task that took a competent armorer roughly 4 minutes with a set of go/no-go gauges and a combination wrench that smelled perpetually of Hopp's No. 9 solvent. The Luftwaffe and the Kriegsmarine knew the Americans used .50 caliber machine guns. German intelligence had accurate specifications for the M2 by 1941 at the latest. What they did not grasp, what their own experience with the smaller 13mm MG 131 gave them no reason to suspect, concerned the ammunition, not the gun. German API rounds for the MG 131 used a steel core rather than tungsten-carbide and carried a smaller incendiary payload. The performance gap between the American .50 caliber API and the German 13mm API, at ranges under 400 yards against thin plate, exceeded 40% in penetration depth alone. German naval damage assessment officers calculated strafing lethality based on their own ammunition performance, extrapolated to the American caliber. The extrapolation missed the tungsten core entirely. A captured Kriegsmarine lieutenant commander, interrogated at Fort Hunt in 1944, described American strafing attacks on coastal vessels in the Mediterranean as something his training had never addressed. "We prepared for bombs," he said through a translator. "The machine guns were supposed to suppress the deck crews, not sink the ship." 14 words. The entire German miscalculation. Suppression rather than destruction. Harassment rather than something that could actually kill a vessel. The M2 that John Browning had designed to punch through German armor plate in 1918 had spent 2 decades in bureaucratic hibernation, emerged with ammunition its inventor never saw, and arrived over the Adriatic capable of doing something the enemy's own models said a machine gun could not do. The Kriegsmarine's damage tables listed strafing as a Category 3 threat, below bombs and torpedoes and mines, roughly equivalent to near-miss shell splashes from naval gunfire. Category 3 meant you did not alter course, you manned the flak guns, returned fire, and accepted superficial damage as the cost of operating within range of enemy airfields. TA-27's crew manned their flak guns. Benjamin O. Davis Jr. signed the transfer orders in March of 1944, and with that signature, the 332nd Fighter Group left behind their P-39 Airacobras, underpowered, maintenance-heavy, unloved by every pilot who ever flew one in combat, and received Republic P-47 Thunderbolts fresh from the Evansville, Indiana production line. The planes arrived at Montecorvino Airfield in southern Italy, smelling of factory primer and hydraulic fluid that hadn't yet baked in Mediterranean sun. Each one carried 8 wing-mounted M2 Browning .50 caliber machine guns, 425 rounds per gun, 3,400 rounds total, loaded in belts that alternated armor-piercing incendiary with tracer every 5th round, so the pilot could see where his fire walked across a target. 8 guns firing simultaneously produced a combined rate of 6,400 rounds per minute, 107 rounds per second, leaving the wings in a convergence pattern that the armorers set, depending on mission type, to intersect at either 300 or 1,000 feet ahead of the aircraft. Stop on the math for a second. A PT boat, the Navy's own dedicated small combatant killer, carried 4 .50 caliber guns and 2 twin-mount 20mm Oerlikon cannon. The P-47 carried double the .50 caliber armament of a PT boat, delivered from above at 400 miles per hour, concentrated into a firing window of roughly 3 seconds per pass. A single Thunderbolt on a strafing run put more API rounds into a target per second than a PT boat could generate with all guns firing. The 332nd Standard Patrol Formation over the Adriatic flew 4 aircraft. 4 Thunderbolts meant 32 50 caliber guns, 8 times the heavy machine gun firepower of a PT boat. Arriving from an axis, the target's deck-mounted flak could barely track. The Kriegsmarine had no damage table for this. Nobody did. Davis knew what his pilots carried. More precisely, he knew what the Army Air Forces had spent 2 years trying to prove his pilots could not carry, could not maintain, could not aim, could not employ, with the precision and aggression required of a fighter group in an active theater. The entire institutional history of the 332nd traced back to a 1941 War Department study that concluded Negro pilots lacked the reflexes, the spatial awareness, and the psychological stability for aerial combat. The study cited cranial measurements. It referenced reaction time tests administered under conditions designed to produce failure. It recommended that colored personnel be restricted to service and transport roles. Declassified in 1974, the document runs to 43 pages. The word incapable appears 11 times. Davis, West Point class of 1936, the first black graduate in 47 years. A man who endured 4 years of silence from his white classmates without breaking, took those 43 pages and answered them with sortie rates. His pilots flew escort missions over Anzio, ground attack sweeps along the Italian boot, and in the spring of 1944, as the 15th Air Force shifted resources towards strategic targets deeper in Europe, the 332nd drew coastal interdiction duty along the Adriatic and Aegean, hunting the very ships the Kriegsmarine relied on to supply its garrisons in Yugoslavia and Greece, the missions nobody wanted. Low-altitude, high-risk strafing runs against vessels that shot back with 20mm and 37mm flak, flying that 8 pilots and produced no headlines. Davis took the assignment without protest because protest accomplished nothing and combat results accomplished everything. His pilots discovered something over the Adriatic that spring. The P-47's 850 caliber guns, loaded with API ammunition and fired into the thin-hulled coastal vessels that made up the bulk of German Adriatic shipping, did not merely suppress. They killed. A 2-second burst from a P-47 put approximately 214 API rounds into a target area roughly 6 feet wide. Against a 500-ton coastal freighter or a repurposed Italian torpedo boat, that concentration of tungsten-carbide penetrators and incendiary compound produced results that looked like bomb damage, fires below the waterline, sympathetic detonations in ammunition stores, hulls opened along seams that the original Italian builders had welded for peacetime service speeds, not combat stress, entire vessels gutted by gunfire alone. The 332nd's after-action reports from April and May of 1944 list vessel after vessel damaged or destroyed by strafing alone. No bombs expended, no rockets fired. Mission kill achieved through machine gun fire, delivered at masthead height by pilots the Army's own pseudoscience had declared unfit to fly. The German sailors on those ships had no way of knowing who flew the aircraft above them. American markings on the fuselage, the distinctive red-painted tails that the 332nd adopted as unit identification, though whether coastal vessel crews at sea level could distinguish tail color from a diving fighter remains an open question the records do not answer. What they experienced, concretely, amounted to an attack density and accuracy that their threat assessments had not predicted from strafing fighters. Their flak crews fired back. Some scored hits. P-47s came home with holes in their engine cowlings, oil streaking across windscreens, hydraulic lines severed. The Thunderbolt absorbed damage the way its designers intended. That 2,000 horsepower Pratt and Whitney R2800 radial engine could take a 20mm shell through a cylinder bank and keep running long enough to get a pilot home. The ship, taking 200 rounds through its hull plating, enjoyed no such resilience. The paint smelled wrong. German sailors who boarded the former Italian warships in the autumn of 1943 reported it immediately. A sweet, almost chemical odor baked into the bulkheads from years of Italian marine enamel that the Kriegsmarine did not use and could not source replacements for. Below that, the bilge carried a different signature: standing water, mixed with lubricating oil from Italian-made auxiliary pumps, whose seals had begun deteriorating months before the armistice. T-27, ne Auriga, stank of a navy that no longer existed, crewed by men who spoke the wrong language to read half the valve labels in her engine room. She belonged to the Adriatic class, a series of torpedo boats laid down in the mid-1930s by the Regia Marina for a specific and limited purpose: fast coastal attack in the confined waters of the central Mediterranean. The Italians built 16 of them between 1937 and 1943. Displacement ran to roughly 1,000 tons at full load, length 269 feet, top speed on paper 31.5 knots, though by 1943, most hulls in the class could barely sustain 28 after years of hard running and deferred maintenance in a navy that prioritized its cruiser fleet for yard time. The Adriatic class carried two 450mm torpedo tubes, a single 100mm deck gun forward, and light anti-aircraft armament that the Italians upgraded haphazardly as the war progressed. A 20mm Breda here, a 13.2mm twin mount there. Nothing standardized, nothing consistent between ships. Hull plating on the Adriatic class measured between 8 and 12 millimeters of mild steel along the waterline, tapering to 6 millimeters on the upper works. The deck, and this detail matters for what happened later, incorporated sections of teak planking over steel subdeck in the traditional Italian fashion, a construction choice that reduced topside weight and improved stability in rough seas, but introduced a material that burned. Teak planking saturated with years of salt spray and deck sealant does not catch fire easily under normal conditions. Spray it with fragments of incendiary compound burning at 1400 degrees Fahrenheit, and the calculation changes. The magazines sat low in the hull, as they did on every warship, but the Adriatic class used a ventilation system for its forward magazine that drew air through a trunk running vertically from a deck-level intake to the magazine compartment below. Italian designers placed the intake behind a splinter shield that would deflect horizontal fragments from a shell burst. The shield stood 18 inches high. It had not been designed to stop rounds arriving at a 45-degree angle from a diving aircraft, a threat axis that Italian naval architects in 1937 had no reason to consider, because no fighter aircraft in any air force on Earth carried armament capable of penetrating a ship's hull plating from that angle at that time. By 1944, the geometry of that ventilation trunk amounted to a funnel pointed at the sky, shielded against a threat that no longer represented the primary danger and open to the one that did. The Kriegsmarine inherited 7 Adriatic-class boats after the Italian armistice. They redesignated them with TA prefix hull numbers, Torpedo Boot Ausland, Foreign Torpedo Boat, and pressed them into service across the Adriatic and Aegean, with German crews who received, at best, 2 weeks of familiarization training before their first patrol. The yard time required to bring these vessels up to Kriegsmarine standards did not exist. German shipyards in the Mediterranean operated under constant Allied air attack, short on skilled labor, shorter on steel plate. The modifications that actually reached the TA boats amounted to radio equipment swaps and the addition of German-pattern depth charge racks aft. The hull plating stayed as it was. So did the magazine ventilation, the teak deck sections, the splinter shields, all of it conceived for a threat environment that had ceased to exist somewhere around 1942. The ships went to sea as the Italians had built them, carrying German ammunition in Italian-designed magazines, ventilated through Italian-designed trunks, shielded by Italian-designed splinter guards. TA-27 sailed the Adriatic in the spring and summer of 1944 without dedicated air cover. The Luftwaffe in the Mediterranean theater had been bled down to fewer than 200 operational fighters by mid-1944, spread across Italy, southern France, the Aegean, and the Balkans. Coastal convoy escort fell so far down the priority list that most TA boat commanders operated on the assumption that they would handle air threats with their own flak batteries. Those batteries, the mixed Italian and German light guns that varied from ship to ship, could engage targets at ranges out to about 2,000 yards with any accuracy. A P-47 in a diving strafing run covered 2,000 yards in approximately 10 seconds. The flak crew got one chance, maybe two bursts, before the fighter reached a range where the Brownings could answer. At 500 yards, the engagement became mutual. At 300 yards, the pilot held every advantage. He chose the angle, the duration, the point of aim. The ship could not maneuver fast enough to change its profile. 31 knots, even if TA-27 could still make 31 knots, which she probably could not, translates to roughly 52 feet per second. A P-47 closed at 580 feet per second. The speed differential made evasion a mathematical fiction. The crew drilled on their flak guns. They maintained watch rotations. They followed standing orders to hug the coastline, where possible, and transit open water only at night or under low cloud cover. All of it rational. All of it built on the assumption that a strafing fighter represented a survivable event, Category 3, suppression, superficial damage, patch and proceed. The assumption held for every engagement model the Kriegsmarine had ever tested against its own 13mm ammunition, extrapolated upward. It did not hold against 8 American 50 caliber guns loaded with tungsten core incendiary, fired into a hull the thickness of a filing cabinet. Gwyn Pearson pushed the stick forward and felt the P-47's nose drop through the horizon line, the Adriatic tilting up to fill his windscreen in a sheet of gray-green glass. Below him, TA-27 carved a white wake against the flat water, heading northeast along the Dalmatian coast at what looked like 25 knots, not sprinting, not crawling, holding a transit speed that suggested her crew had not yet registered the 4 aircraft descending from 11,000 feet in a staggered echelon that put 60 seconds between each pass. The morning air at altitude smelled of nothing. Below 3,000 feet, it would smell of salt and exhaust, and very soon, of things burning that were not supposed to burn. The first pass belonged to the flight leader. Standard doctrine for the 330 seconds coastal interdiction missions placed the lead aircraft on an approach angle of 30 to 45 degrees off the target's bow, diving from between 8 and 4,000 feet, opening fire at approximately 800 yards and holding the trigger through to 200. At 800 yards, the convergence pattern spread the 8 guns' fire across a footprint roughly 20 feet wide, enough to bracket a vessel of TA-27's beam, but not enough to concentrate killing force on any single section of hull. The geometry tightened as the range closed. At 400 yards, the footprint shrank to 10 feet. At 200 yards, the point where a pilot with functioning survival instincts began his pullout, the 8 streams of API rounds converged into an area smaller than a dining table. Everything within that area received approximately 35 rounds per second for the final half-second of the pass. The tracers, every 5th round, drew lines of orange light that appeared to move slowly from the pilot's perspective and impossibly fast from the deck. TA-27's flak crews opened fire. The 20mm Breda mounts forward, and amidships began tracking, their characteristic sharp bark lost entirely in the windstream noise inside a diving Thunderbolt's cockpit. The pilot saw muzzle flashes. He saw Tracer arcing toward him in the lazy-looking curves that meant the rounds carried lethal velocity. He held his line. The Brownings answered at 600 yards, a sound the pilot felt more than heard, a deep vibration transmitted through the airframe into the seat, into the rudder pedals, into the bones of his hands on the stick. Spent brass and disintegrating links ejected from the wing roots in a glittering stream that the slipstream scattered behind the aircraft like metal confetti. The first burst walked across TA-27's foredeck from port to starboard. API rounds struck the teak planking and punched through into the steel subdeck beneath, each impact producing a bright white flash as the incendiary compound ignited on penetration. The teak splintered rather than spalling, wood fragments instead of steel fragments, less lethal to exposed crew, but carrying burning incendiary material outward in a spray pattern that deposited fire across a radius of several feet from each strike point. Rounds that missed the teak hit the steel upper works directly. At 200 yards, the tungsten-carbide core of the API round defeated 6mm mild steel without meaningful deceleration. the copper jacket stripped away on entry, the incendiary compound, a mixture based on barium nitrate and powdered aluminum that Frankfurt Arsenal had perfected across 6 years of testing, ignited behind the plate in a flash that reached 1400 degrees Fahrenheit within milliseconds. Anything flammable on the other side of that plate caught fire: paint, cork insulation, rope, canvas covers over ammunition, ready lockers, human clothing. The flight leader pulled out at 150 yards, banking hard right, the G-forces pressing him into his seat as TA-27's superstructure rotated beneath his wing. Behind him, the second Thunderbolt had already committed to its dive. 4 passes, 4 aircraft, each one delivering between 150 and 220 API rounds into a vessel 269 feet long and 28 feet wide. The second and third pilots adjusted their aim points based on what they could see. Fires burning amidships, flak fire diminishing from the forward mounts, smoke beginning to trail from somewhere near the waterline. The fourth pilot, running in last, reported afterward that the ship's outline had changed. Smoke obscured the superstructure. The forward deck gun sat at an angle that suggested its mounting had been struck. No flak came from the forward positions. The aft 20mm still fired, its tracers passing behind the diving Thunderbolt by a margin the pilot estimated at 50 feet. He aimed for the waterline amidships and held the trigger for 3 seconds, the longest burst any of the 4 pilots reported, and roughly 640 rounds delivered into a horizontal strip of hull plating that had already absorbed hits from the previous passes. One of those rounds, or several, the distinction no longer mattered, found the magazine ventilation trunk. The intake sat behind its 18-inch splinter shield, oriented to deflect horizontal fragments from a shell burst at sea level. The API rounds arrived at 40 degrees from vertical, moving at 2,700 feet per second. The splinter shield deflected nothing. Rounds entered the trunk, passed through the sheet metal ducting, and reached the magazine compartment carrying incendiary compound that had already ignited on contact with the trunk walls. The magazine held German-manufactured 100mm ammunition for the forward deck gun, propellant charges in brass casings stacked in ready racks designed to Italian naval specifications. The detonation broke TA-27's keel. Witnesses on the nearby coast described a column of black smoke that rose vertically for several hundred feet before the wind took it. The bow section separated from the stern within minutes. Both halves sank independently in water, shallow enough that portions of the wreckage remained visible above the surface for days afterward. 32 Browning M2 machine guns, tungsten-carbide armor-piercing incendiary ammunition. 800 rounds, give or take, delivered in 4 passes lasting fewer than 12 seconds of combined trigger time. A warship killed by bullet holes. Korvettenkapitän Ernst Brandt filed his loss report from the signals office at Split on the evening of the sinking, and the report contained a word that would travel up the chain of command like a virus: Bordwaffen, aircraft guns, not bombs, torpedoes, or mines. Bordwaffen, the generic Kriegsmarine term for fixed forward-firing armament on fighter aircraft, a category that German naval intelligence had classified since 1941 as a harassment weapon, capable of causing topside damage to exposed personnel and unshielded equipment, but structurally irrelevant to any vessel displacing more than 300 tons. TA-27 displaced 1,000. She carried armor, thin armor, Italian armor, but armor nonetheless. She mounted dedicated anti-aircraft weapons crewed by trained gunners who fired back, and she sank, not from flooding, caused by a near-miss bomb concussion that sprang her plates, not from a torpedo that broke her back in a single detonation, from bullet holes. Hundreds of them, punched through her hull and superstructure by ammunition that weighed 1.5 ounces per round, fired from guns that a single man could carry. The report reached Marinegruppenkommando Süd within 48 hours. Sources conflict on the initial response. One post-war FMS debrief, conducted in 1947 with a former staff officer whose name the document redacts, describes the reaction as disbelief followed by a request for clarification, followed by a second request for clarification. The staff assumed a coding error. Bordwaffen did not sink warships. The category did not permit it. German damage assessment models, built on extensive testing of their own 7.92mm and 13mm aircraft guns against captured Allied vessel sections, showed that fighter-caliber weapons could not achieve hull penetration at combat ranges against steel plate thicker than 5mm. The American 50 caliber round, 12.7 millimeters, firing a tungsten-carbide penetrator at 2,900 feet per second from a gun the Germans consistently misidentified in intelligence summaries as analogous to their own 13mm MG-131, fell outside the model. Not because German intelligence lacked data on the Browning M2. They had captured examples and fired them. They had measured the muzzle velocity, weighed the projectiles, catalogued the ammunition types. The data sat in files at the Marinerrüstungsamt. Nobody had run it against the hull specifications of their own TA boats, because nobody had asked the question. Because the question, can a fighter's machine gun sink one of our warships, belonged to a category of inquiry that institutional assumptions had foreclosed before it could be raised. The Bismarck Sea had already answered it 5 months earlier, 14,000 miles away. On March 2, 1943, during the Battle of the Bismarck Sea, 5th Air Force B-25s modified with forward-firing 50 caliber gun packages, 4, 6, sometimes 8 Brownings mounted in the nose and cheek positions, attacked a Japanese troop convoy northwest of New Britain at masthead height. The strafers swept the decks of the transport ships and their destroyer escorts before the skip bombers came in behind them. After-action photography showed Japanese destroyers with their superstructures shredded, flak crews killed at their guns, bridge windows blown inward, fires burning in compartments that 50 caliber API had opened to the air. The skip bombs sank the transports. The strafing killed the men who could have fought the fires. 8 transports and 4 destroyers went to the bottom. General George Kenney, commanding 5th Air Force, noted in his report to MacArthur that the strafing passes had been ichthyologically effective, his odd, almost playful term for attacks that turned ships into something resembling gutted fish. The Japanese Navy's own assessment, recovered post-war, used language less colorful and more alarmed. Low-altitude machine gun attack from heavy fighters represented, in the words of one translated staff summary, a threat category for which no adequate countermeasure exists within current convoy defense doctrine. The Kriegsmarine never received that Japanese assessment. The two navies shared almost nothing operationally meaningful, despite their nominal alliance. German naval intelligence monitored Allied air tactics in the Pacific through intercepts and attaché reports, but the specific lethality of concentrated 50 caliber fire against thin-hulled warships, the precise lesson the Bismarck Sea had taught, did not appear in any Kriegsmarine tactical bulletin issued before TA-27's loss. The file is empty. Whether this represents an intelligence failure, a communication failure, or the institutional arrogance of a Navy that believed its own damage models over an Allies' combat experience, the records do not specify. What the records do show, after TA-27, the Kriegsmarine issued revised standing orders for TA boat operations in the Adriatic. The orders mandated nighttime-only transit of open water. They required coastal navigation within 500 meters of shore, where terrain provided masking from aerial observation. They doubled the recommended flak ammunition loadout per patrol. They did not, and this is the detail that matters, the one that reveals how deep the institutional denial ran. Reclassify fighter strafing from a Category 3 survivable event to a Category 1 lethal threat. The models stayed. The assumption that a warship could absorb machine gun fire and continue operating remained embedded in Kriegsmarine doctrine through the end of the Mediterranean campaign. TA boats continued to sail. TA boats continued to die. By August of 1944, the Kriegsmarine had lost 4 of its 7 Adriatic TA boats to air attack, and in each case the primary weapon was the same, the 50 caliber Browning M2, firing API ammunition from American fighters whose pilots had learned to aim for the waterline. 4 ships, same weapon, same result each time. The model never changed, 56,863. That figure represents the number of Browning M2 aircraft pattern receivers manufactured by 6 American factories between January 1942 and December 1944. 6 factories, operating 3 shifts, turning out guns built to tolerances so tight that a receiver assembled in Buffalo, New York, could accept a barrel manufactured in Saginaw, Michigan, a bolt group from Springfield, Massachusetts, and a backplate from a subcontractor in New Haven, Connecticut. And the assembled weapon would fire within specification on the first test. No hand fitting, no factory-specific parts bins, no gunsmith standing between the assembly line and the flight line. The interchangeability rate across all 6 plants exceeded 97%, a number the Ordnance Department published in its 1945 production summary, with a flatness that obscures what it actually meant. Any 50 caliber gun, on any aircraft in any theater, fired the same ammunition at the same velocity with the same penetration characteristics, and every pilot who pressed his trigger got the same result. The Germans achieved nothing comparable with their aircraft cannon program. The MG 151/20 fired a heavier shell, but required factory-matched components that made field replacement a maintenance nightmare. The MK 108, mounted in the Bf 109's engine block, demanded alignment procedures so exacting that Luftwaffe armorers in forward airfields sometimes waited weeks for depot-level technicians. The Japanese situation ran worse. Malfunctions in the Ho-5 20mm cannon plagued Army Key 61 units through 1944, with failure rates that one captured maintenance officer at a USSBS interrogation in Manila called an embarrassment we could not discuss in reports to Tokyo. The American system did not produce the best individual weapon. Round for round, a 20mm mine shell delivered more destructive energy than a 50 caliber API bullet. German and Japanese engineers understood this and designed accordingly. Fewer guns, larger caliber, greater lethality per hit. The approach made sense on paper and collapsed in practice because it assumed that individual weapon quality mattered more than systemic reliability multiplied across tens of thousands of airframes. 8 Brownings per P-47, 6 per Hellcat, 6 per Corsair, 6 per Mustang. Every one of them firing M8 API ammunition from the same Frankfurt Arsenal specification. Every tungsten-carbide core pressed from the same grade of powder metallurgy blank. Every incendiary charge mixed to the same formula. The weapon became infrastructure. It stopped being a gun a pilot carried and became a capability the entire Air Force possessed, as standardized and dependable as the fuel in the tanks or the oxygen in the masks. The Germans documented the effect with a precision that bordered on clinical detachment. General Major Fritz Bayerlein, commanding the Panzer Lehr Division in Normandy, told his American interrogators that fighter-bomber strafing with heavy-caliber guns had destroyed more soft-skinned vehicles in his division's rear areas than medium bomber attacks, not because each pass caused more damage, but because the passes never stopped. Every flight of 4 aircraft carried 32 of these guns, Bayerlein stated in his FMS debrief. They came in relays. We could not repair faster than they could destroy. The arithmetic overwhelmed him. The quantity the system made possible mattered more than any single attack's precision. TA-27 proved the same arithmetic at sea. 4 P-47s carrying 32 guns between them sank a warship in under 2 minutes of combined engagement time without expending a single piece of ordnance heavier than 1.5 ounces. The Kriegsmarine's damage models failed because they measured the wrong variable, the individual round, when what mattered was the system behind it. The production base that made the round, the factories that made the gun, the training pipeline that made the pilot, the logistics chain that put API ammunition on a forward airfield in southern Italy within 72 hours of it, leaving a loading dock in New Jersey. TA-27 did not collide with 4 pilots. She collided with an industrial civilization that had decided somewhere around 1940 to standardize violence at a scale no other nation could match or even comprehend until it arrived overhead. Gwyn Pearson survived the war. He returned to the United States, separated from the Army Air Forces, and built a civilian life whose details the public record tracks only intermittently. The 332nd Fighter Group flew its last combat mission on April 30, 1945, an escort run to Linz, Austria. The group's P-47s had long since given way to P-51 Mustangs by then. The Thunderbolts transferred to other units or sent to modification depots, where some received new paint and new squadron markings, and others went straight to surplus. The specific P-47 that Pearson flew against TA-27 carries a serial number the records do not preserve in connection with his name. Whether that airframe ended its service life in a smelter in Texas, a boneyard in Arizona, or a crate bound for a foreign air force under post-war military assistance programs, the documentation does not say. TA-27's wreckage sat in shallow Adriatic water for decades. Croatian divers surveyed the site in the early 2000s and found both hull sections largely intact on the sandy bottom, the break at the keel still sharp-edged where the magazine detonation had torn the steel apart. Marine growth covered the superstructure. The forward deck gun lay 40 meters from the bow section, thrown clear by the blast. The splinter shield that guarded the magazine ventilation trunk, 18 inches of mild steel angled against a threat that arrived from the wrong direction, rested upright on the seabed, still bolted to its deck mounting, its outboard face pitted with 6 or 7 holes, approximately half an inch in diameter.